Good. One of the topics that we decided to talk about was the South China Sea and the conflicts that were taking place in the South China Sea. One of the reasons we decided to choose this topic was that it was reoccurring in the news. It was quite prevalent, or it has been quite prevalent since when I started here last year, and it directly affects the students and their families and people in this geographical region of the world. So three of the categories that are very important in order to understand any news or any world issue is geography, civics, and geography, civics, and history. And these three categories are especially important for an issue like the South China Sea because there are so many different countries and very diverse geography that are involved, and the history is very complex between all of the different countries, and each of the different countries have very different political systems as well. So the first place we usually start in talking about any world issue is geography. Because if you don't know where the countries are, or you don't understand the countries, then you're not going to understand the news. And you're not going to understand when we're talking about those different countries. So the first thing that we did was just put the countries' names up and their different flags, and we kind of had the students try to guess which flag belonged to which country. And from there, we moved on to an actual map and looking at the 8 different countries. Just for reference, those countries are Brunei, Philippines, Taiwan, China, Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia. So then we put a map up on the board, and we showed the students the different 8 countries and how the relationships are in between the 8 different countries. And we actually asked the students to try to guess what the topic was going to be that we were going to talk about. I think there were 2 out of the 4 classes that we had that actually were able to guess the world issue that we were going to talk about, just based solely on seeing the 8 different countries. The next thing that we did was put the students into groups of 4, and we gave them the flags. And we just told them, we said, okay, take the flag and put it on the correct country. Now, a lot of them were like, how do we do that? How are we going to possibly know where the country is? And some of them actually figured out the problem, or on their own, they figured out the solution on their own, was to actually get out their geography books that they had, and they started looking at the world map and trying to match the map that we gave them with their map in the book, and they started pasting the flags on it. So that was really nice to see that some of them were actually using problem-solving skills. They weren't just purely relying on listening to the teacher. They were starting to be able to figure out and learn on their own, that kind of thing. So then after we had them figure out where the different locations were, we started introducing the idea of the economical zones that each country contains that goes out into the sea. And for me, it was quite surprising because when I was explaining how the EEZ works, the zone that goes out into the sea, the students already seemed to understand what that was. And it turned out that they had already actually learned this in their Chinese geography class. So when I explained it in English, they were able to pick it up very quickly. And then they just drew the line for each country where they thought their EEZ went out into the sea. And then we gave them a quiz to make sure that they all kind of were on the same page and they understood where the geography was. And then we started talking more about the conflicts that are involved and why these different countries are showing up in the news every day. 3 easy words that we thought we would teach them were fish, oil, and shipping. Okay? So fish, oil, and shipping are arguably, they're most likely the 3 biggest issues that are happening in the South China Sea. fish, oil, and shipping, they all translate into one thing, and that is money. So the reason that the South China Sea is going to be so important in the future, and why it's so important now, is because of money and resources. And each of these countries in the region, they're all fighting with each other because they want money, they want resources, they want fish, they want to be able to feed their people. They need oil in order to operate factories, in order to operate cars, and in order to run planes. A whole economy depends on oil. So because there's so much fish, because there's so much oil in the South China Sea, of course it's going to be a lot of tension and a lot of fighting between different people in the region. Okay, so we looked at some news stories that were popular at that time. We gave them some quizzes. We tried to reinforce all of the different things that we had learned up to that point so that we could start getting into an activity. And Mr. Lee and myself, we designed a game that the students could play that incorporated oil, money, fish, in order to try to keep your country happy. So every country were represented in the game, and you had to try to make sure that your people had enough food, they had enough money, and they had enough oil in order to survive. If your country ran out of any of those things, then one of your people in your country would die. And we tried to separate the countries into real-life data. So for example, China has a lot of people, but they don't have much oil. Taiwan has a lot of money, but it has almost no oil. Brunei has a lot of oil, but it doesn't have many people, and it doesn't have any food, really. So these countries each have their own negotiating powers, and in order to make sure that the conflicts don't happen, we've got to be able to trade. We've got to be able to move these products back and forth with each other. So what we did was we separated 5 countries by people and resources in the classroom. And we gave each of those countries cards. And the cards were either food, fish, or money. And each round, the students got to trade with another country. And they could choose which country they wanted to trade with. So for example, Taiwan could trade with Brunei. And they would have to ask a question in English. You know, Brunei, do you want some money for oil? Something very easy like that. And Brunei could choose, yes we do, or no we don't. And at the end of a round, we would see, does every person in your country have one oil, one money, and one food? And if they did not, then someone would die in their country. And the goal of the game was to make sure that nobody died in your country. What we tried to do was just really represent the real world situation that's happening in the South China Sea. Is that governments have to make sure that their people have enough food, they have enough oil, and they have enough money to keep the government surviving and the people happy. It was just basically trying to get them to do an activity that helped them understand when they watch the news and they see conflicts in the South China Sea, you know, why is this happening? The last thing that we did was we put the students into groups and we went to the computer room and we had them prepare presentations. So within their country, for example, let's say they had China, they needed to find one famous person, one famous food, one famous place, one famous city, and one famous holiday. 5 categories for that country per person in their group. So if they had 5 people in their group, they had to find 5 famous people, 5 famous foods, 5 famous places, 5 famous cities, 5 famous holidays, and so on. And they prepared a presentation and they taught that presentation in front of the class. Then later on, we used the pictures that the students put into their presentations and we made a game. And what we would do is we would just put the picture of one of those things, for example, maybe a famous person. We would put a picture of a famous person and the students had to try to guess which country it was based off of seeing the famous person. If they guessed correctly just on one picture, then they got a lot of points, 50 points. If nobody knew, then we would go on to the next one, and the points would go down from 50 to 40. During any round, if a student guessed incorrectly, they would lose 20 points. So there was some risk in trying to guess. And the way that we did it was using two sides of a whiteboard, a whiteboard that has two sides, and they would write their guess on one side so the students on the other side couldn't see what the guess was. If they guessed incorrectly and they lost points, they could try to guess again later. Okay, this way the students that were on the other side, they didn't know which country was correct and which country was incorrect, and the game could keep going until every group guessed correctly. Usually by the fifth picture, the students all knew which country it was. Usually the pictures started to become easier around the third or fourth picture. So we did that with almost every country in the South China Sea. Again, we were trying to reinforce and make sure that they understood these different countries, their cultures, this kind of thing, so that we were focusing on civics, government, history, and geography. And then the last thing we added in at the end with these presentations was some culture, because culture is also quite important when you're dealing with these kind of global issues. Okay. So something that has made this class exciting and fun and challenging is current events. So when I meet with my co-teacher, Mr. Lee, we usually, or actually we always look at the current events, the things that are happening in the world right now, what's in the news, and we talk about how are we going to develop a curriculum to match what is in the news. And then we talked about what the government was recommending that the students do to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. And so we did a nice class just talking about the 5 things that the government was recommending at that time, which were wear a mask, wash your hands, check your temperature, avoid crowds, and don't touch your nose, eyes, and mouth. And those things are pretty easy to teach, actually, because there's a lot of actions and there were already a lot of animations. And we kind of talked about how the virus spreads from respiratory breathing and the droplets and how it can get on your hands and things like that. And so a lot of those things are that we were teaching are actually actions, you know, like wash your hands. We know we have a student that practices washing their hands. All the other kids get to watch, and we made a video. A live feed of a student washing their hands, and it was pretty fun, and it kind of helped calm the situation down because it was kind of a stressful time at that time. The students had just come back, nobody really knew what was happening, and so it's always good to have a class where, you know, the students can just kind of relax a little bit and do some activities. We kept on moving on to the next classes, which started moving into the spread of the virus. We started to push the students to start doing some activities, and we started with them drawing a world map, and we just tried to have them just draw the world map from memory. And some of the students were like, oh, that's impossible, you know, there's no way we can do that. And the other students were like, okay, well, let's give it a try. And you started to see them, you know, sometimes the proportions were completely wrong and they couldn't remember certain things. But it was just one of those tactics or strategies that you use as a teacher to try to just get them to try. Just go for it, you know, and then after we can teach you and we can try to learn. So then after we had them try to draw it from memory, then we put the map up on the board and we said, okay, try again. Now that you can see the map, then try to draw it again. Okay, so we used the map to try to help talk about the coronavirus spread. And we looked at the countries that were having the highest number of infections and the highest number of deaths at that time. And what we started to see and we started to talk about was the relationships between those countries. We found a great video on YouTube that showed how the virus spread and where the numbers went for each country, and we showed them that video. The cartoon or the animation is called SpongeBob SquarePants, and I think almost every student in junior high will know this cartoon. It's an extremely popular cartoon for kids all over the world. And so the cartoon used these simple animations from the cartoon to explain very complex news and situations that were happening in the world, especially in the West, especially in the United States where I was from. So the first thing we did was just put the cartoon up on a screen. And each cartoon has a very small English kind of funny, or a title, I guess is the best word for it, a small title that kind of summarizes the picture. And we put the students into groups of 4, and we asked them to try and guess why SpongeBob SquarePants was doing these things based on the news that they were seeing every day. And so, I guess not too surprisingly, but a little bit surprisingly, the students started to get it and they started to guess correctly. Sometimes they didn't understand. Sometimes they just couldn't guess at all. Like, for example, the stock market. They don't know what the stock market is, but when you talk with them and they start to figure out what the stock market is, then they look at the animation and they can think, okay, maybe I heard this on the news, or I heard my family talking about it, and they can start to kind of talk it out. And that's really, I mean, that's what a lot of learning in life is about, is getting the little spark, and then the talking and the reading and the studying is the fire that will eventually build, and you can start to really learn. When you're just by yourself, you know, a lot of times you're just guessing. But when you're in a group and you have a teacher, you can start to really build and learn how to learn. And so that was kind of what we were pushing with this activity, was to have a starting point and then try to figure it out on their own by talking and thinking, and to try to really understand why each cartoon was that way. Okay, so once we got through the talking about it and guessing, we actually started to watch videos that matched up with the news or the cartoon. So each of these little cartoons had an actual news clip that we found, or actually Mr. Lee found, that were from Taiwan. So we talked about it in English first, and I tried to explain or use some keywords to tell them this is what was happening, or this is what is happening. And then we found a video that would explain why SpongeBob was doing this cartoon. We did do a small quiz at the very end to make sure that the students had paid attention and they had written the news down inside of their notebooks. The next thing that we started to do was we started to give the students a homework assignment every week that they could do online. And the online portal was able to be accessed through the Nanlong Junior High website. And the news just captured the stories that were happening around the world that day. And Mr. Lee used the software to give them a 5-question quiz at the end of each news. Sometimes the quiz would be directly related to the content in the video. Sometimes it would be a geographical quiz. You know, if like 6 different countries were mentioned in the video, then each question was just a different quiz question asking where is that country on a map, find the country. So it's actually been pretty cool, and the students have been doing pretty well at answering the questions. I think it takes about 10 minutes of their time, but it's just a way to make sure that they're staying up to date on the current events, so when they come into class, they know what we're talking about. Okay? The last thing that we have been doing is have the students prepare a presentation about a country. And the countries that we used were all of the countries that had the highest infection rates and the highest death rates from the coronavirus confirmed cases. So we used 11 countries because there are about 22 students per class. And so each country had 2 students. Okay? And each presentation had 6 requirements. They had to find a famous person, they had to find a famous food, they had to find a famous city, they had to find a famous place, they had to find a famous holiday, and then they had to show and teach the other students where the country was on the world map. Okay? Now, each of the different topics had to have 3 sentences. Okay? And those 3 sentences had to describe the famous whatever it may be. For example, if they chose a famous person from the United States, they could not just write George Washington and put a picture of George Washington and then be finished. They had to write, why is George Washington famous? What did he do? What was he famous for? You know, tell a little bit about his life. Okay? So, after they were done with their presentations, they had to share it with Teacher Lee or myself, Teacher Lee and myself, and so we were able to see them on Google Documents. And then we could make some comments or ask them for more information or say, you know, like there's something wrong with the grammar here, you know, something like that. And the idea is that they would have to give a presentation later. So after they were finished, we asked them to stand up in front of the class, and they had to do 4 things. They had to introduce themselves and their country, hopefully in English. So we would ask them to say something like, hello, my name is Adam, and I'm going to present Russia today. Something like that. The next thing they had to do was their presentation. And we pushed them to use as much English as possible. It was okay if they wanted to use Chinese, that was okay. I mean, these are very complicated presentations, so to expect them to be all in English was too much. But we tried to push them. We said you would get more points if you spoke in English. And some students, they really did speak in English. They did a great job. All of them wrote something in English, so that was good. The next thing they had to do was accept questions from the class. So if someone asked a question in the class, then that person that asked the question would get extra points. And we made that very clear at the beginning, was that if you asked a question and it was a good question, then you would get some points. And then the last thing was number 4, was they had to take advice from their classmates. So their classmates would listen to the presentation and then they would give some advice. If the students gave advice, then again, they got more points. Okay? So I thought the advice, about half of the advice was actually really good. Some of it was just silly stuff, you know, maybe like a small spelling error. The student would be like, oh, you spelled holiday wrong. You know, something silly like that. Okay, we were not going to give points for it. But if they made some actual advice, like, you know, I think you could have put the picture in a different place or made it clearer, or maybe, you know, maybe the writing needs to be bigger so I can see it, then we would actually give them some points for that. And I will say, we had them do presentations first semester. The second semester, their ability to present was much higher. Their confidence, the quality of the presentation was just much better this time around. So I was happy to see that. And I'm hoping next year we can start getting into more fine details about how to give a good presentation. Okay? So another thing that we did that was related to the coronavirus or COVID-19 was try to present a real-world economic and personal and family and social situation and to make a game out of it so that they can understand the effects of a airborne virus. And so we used 3 very basic places that people go every day. Their home and their family, the store, and the factory. And we made a cycle where the family, the mom and dad, go to the factory to work, and then the factory makes the goods to send to the store, and then the family goes to the store to buy the goods. And the words that we used were quite easy. Work, family, mom and dad, factory, store, and we had pictures, and we made this kind of game out of this concept. And what we did was just kind of show how an airborne virus like a coronavirus can affect this normal economic cycle that we've created in 2020. So what was happening outside of Taiwan, and a little bit in Taiwan, was that the mom and dad were told not to go to work anymore, that it was too dangerous. There's too many people inside of one office or a factory. So they couldn't go to the factory, which meant that the factory couldn't make goods to send to the store. Okay, and then the goods were not going to the store meant that people that went to buy the goods, there was nothing on the shelves. And the other problem was the people weren't getting any money anymore. So the entire economic cycle that we built over the last 60 years since World War II was suddenly falling apart. And everything that we had been taught about economics suddenly was failing when there was this airborne virus that was coming around. And governments weren't ready for it. And what we were seeing in the news was matching up with what was happening in the real world. And so what we did was we put the students into families. And each round, someone got taken out of work and they lost money. And if you lost money, you couldn't buy more things at the store. And if you didn't go to work, the store was producing less goods. Okay? So we actually had an entire economic cycle set up in the classroom. Mr. Lee was the store. He sold the goods. I was the factory owner. I made the goods. And the families were the workers and the consumers. Okay? So they would have to come to me, or I would go to them, and they would have to work. If they worked, which was speaking a little bit of English, I gave them some money. Then they could use their money to go to the store and buy some goods. But each round we took out a worker. So there was less money that was going into the cycle, and then when there was less workers, there were less goods going to the store. So what you started to see happen was kids actually running to the store and trying to buy as much as they could with their money. Okay? And what also happened sometimes was the kids were saving their money because they thought maybe later there would be better goods that they could get. So this is what was really happening in the real world, though, in like places like the United States, Canada, China, was people would go to the store and they would see the goods were less and less and less. For example, meat, toilet paper, cleaning supplies, and they would just buy and buy and buy and buy and buy with the money that they had. And what you started to see was actually people fighting inside of the supermarkets. And what we had sometimes was the students were actually like bumping each other and pushing to try to get to the candy. And so it was very funny to have Mr. Lee put a video of a situation in a supermarket in Australia and the students in the classroom right side by side, both fighting each other, trying to buy goods. And the idea was to help the students understand that this is the real world. This can happen. If there's a war, if there's a pandemic, if there is a major natural catastrophe like an earthquake or a typhoon, the goods suddenly will become more in demand, people will buy more, and suddenly there can be chaos. And unless the government steps in and controls the situation, it can get quite nasty, actually. And what we saw in places like America and Australia, where the government wants to give people complete freedom and they did not control the situation, it became quite chaotic in some cases. People were fighting with each other. There were people buying like 1,000 rolls of toilet paper on one visit to the store. You know, and hospital workers were going to the store after work and they couldn't find food. This kind of thing was really happening in the United States. And we could find news stories to reflect what was happening. So we would have them play the game, and then we would watch a news story that actually showed what happened. We'd talk about workers in factories being laid off. We talked about bosses getting less money. We talked about supermarkets having less food. We talked about people staying home without a job. And we played a real world economic game that tried to simplify the very complicated universe of economy. And I think the students actually enjoyed it, and I think they really understood it. So it was good to see. But yeah, and the last little thing we did was, maybe you're wondering, how do they know who has a job and who doesn't? We put 2 little balls into a bag. Actually, we put a lot of balls into a bag, but 2 colors of balls into a bag. If the student drew an orange ball, that meant they had a job. If the student drew a white ball, that meant they had unpaid leave. Okay, so if they drew the white ball, you could see them just right away like, oh no, I have to stay home and I don't get any money. No money, no honey. You don't get to buy the candy anymore. It was a really fun game, and I think it worked out. And we gave them a small quiz at the end, and we asked them to make the economic cycle using laminated cards. And then we'd ask them some simple questions. You know, why does your mom and dad go to work every day? You know, where do they go to work? Who does the factory sell their food to? Where does the store buy their food? Where do your mom and dad go to buy food every day? Just questions like that. And I would say about 80% of the students really could speak in English and understand what was going on. Some of them could understand, but maybe their English just wasn't good enough to express it, and then we'd kind of talk it out, translating Chinese and English. And but the main point was that they were able to use the cards and shift them around and understand the big concept. So yeah, that was a really fun game, and we spent about, it was about 2 weeks talking about and understanding that game. Okay.